Hello, kindred spirits, and welcome to MaudCast, the podcast of the L.M. Montgomery Institute, broadcasting from the beautiful campus of the University of Prince Edward Island. We're so glad you've tuned in. This is MaudCast Season 1, Episode 1, and I am your host, Dr. Brenton Dickieson. In our quest to discover cutting-edge scholarship about the life and works of Lucy Maud Montgomery and join imaginative readers throughout the world, we welcome to the microphone our special guest, Dr. Lesley Clement. Dr. Clement is the L.M. Montgomery Institute's visiting scholar. Lesley has held teaching and administrative positions at various Canadian universities. She has published on visual literacy, empathy, and death in children's literature. Her work on Montgomery appears in Studies in Canadian Literature and L.M. Montgomery and the Matter of Natures. Recent projects include co-editing with Rita Bode, L.M. Montgomery's Rainbow Valleys, The Ontario Years, 1911 to 1942, which, by the way, is a fantastic volume, and with Leyli Jamali, Global Perspectives on Death in Children's Literature. Lesley, welcome to the MaudCast.
Oh, thank you, Brenton, for inviting me to join you.
As MaudCast listeners are avid readers, we like to talk about the books that are on our bedside tables. Sometimes this is Montgomery related, sometimes it's not. Right now I'm reading a YA fantasy that's actually set in the time that Anne of Green Gables was being written. It's Alex E. Harrow's The 10,000 Doors of January, about a young girl named January who finds a portal to another world, but then loses it as a young girl. But then as a teen, she ends up tumbling back into that rabbit hole. I'm only actually that far in, so I'm pretty excited about I love Wardrobe World books, and I really appreciate how this one's going. And it's part of a slate of...
Lewis collection there, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And this is part of an all-woman slate of Hugo Award nominees this year. So this is a pretty special year. So that's what I'm reading. What's on your bookshelf these days?
Like most people, I have several books on the go, but I'll mention one that I think everyone should read, especially in this time of trying to educate ourselves about lives unlike our own. This is Essie Adujan's Washington Black, which takes an 11-year-old field slave in the Caribbean on a journey that, well, even Anne Shirley couldn't imagine. It's so important that these stories don't remain untold backstories in a young person's life. Whereas Washington Black is a novel of darkness with glimmers of light, Montgomery wrote novels of light with shadowy corners generally left unexplored. But we need novels like Montgomery's to bring us joy and hope and the strength of mind to confront the shadows.
Yeah, and some of your work is actually looking at the shadows, right?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. No, I think that's super key, and you do that not just with Montgomery, but you're an expert in children's literature. I've seen your CV. How did you find your way into Montgomery's work specifically?
As a scholar, I certainly found my way into Montgomery's work through children's literature. But of course, as a reader, like so many other people, I was reading her as a child. I grew up in a community on the Kennebecasis River in New Brunswick, between St. John and Rossay. And of course, again, like so many other readers, I was first introduced to Anne and Emily. They entered my life when I was a child, and then as a young teen, Pat entered into my life.
So she went from, bedside reading to your desk over time.
Exactly.
I think that's going to be a story we hear quite a bit.
Yeah.
For me, there's just so many ways that Montgomery's life and works invite us as readers and researchers. So when it comes to your Montgomery work, like where specifically are you focusing? Like what's kind of on your heart to be talking about?
Well, as you said, you've read my CV, so you know it's quite diverse because there are so many ways that her works invite us into. So many different ways to explore it. So when I began writing on Montgomery, I was exploring the idea of empathy. And in particular, I was linking empathy with visual literacy. And I was working on that in the context of children's picture books. But then as I began to apply it to Montgomery, I became interested in how empathy and visual literacy was linked to creativity. So that became a part of it. But at the same time, I had started a book on death in children's literature, which you mentioned when you introduced me. And of course, that's another way of exploring Montgomery's work. And so I have some articles that are coming out that focus on that aspect. And currently I'm working on a couple of projects. One is on childhood in Montgomery, and another evolved out of the work that I did for the volume on Lucy Maud Montgomery in Ontario, in which I focus on the toll that's taken on a public figure and how that erodes and just eats away at her private being, at her private self. So, and I'm actually, because my keynote talk was going to be on literary tourism, and there's a really interesting link I found between the time when she was most a literary tourist was on her honeymoon, and that was a time when she was just moving from being a private citizen to being a public figure, and all the things that she was seeing and how they spoke to her. So. I hope to continue that work later on this year.
No, that's really intriguing. And I also think, too, about in her diaries when she would visit Prince Edward Island or Muskoka, I think the first time, they almost become, they move from, tourism, but through new eyes, recovery eyes, right? So you could see how she could really add to that visual aspect of things. That's actually, I think you're definitely on the right track there. And that keynote was part of your work as a visiting scholar? Because I love this about the L.M. Montgomery Institute. The visiting scholar program is such a great idea. Just tell us a bit about that work, if you would.
Okay, well, generally, if I could just speak generally about what a visiting scholar does. So apart from the research and delivering one of the keynote talks, there's usually 3 or 4 of those. One of the important things that the visiting scholar does now is assume the role of the co-editor, as being co-editor of the journal of Lucy Maud Montgomery Studies. And I'll assume that role on the 1st of July. So for me, and again, this isn't necessarily what all visiting scholars would do, but for me, that's I'm going to be working on a collection of papers on the conference theme, which is vision. As well, next year, Jean Mitchell and I are going to be working on a special issue on mental health as well. So as co-editor of the journal, that's a main thing that the visiting scholar does. But another main thing that the visiting scholar is responsible for is being a co-organizer of the biennial conference. So just give you a little bit of history of what happened, right? With that, once I became the visiting scholar, and this was back in the spring of 2019, Emily Worcester, who was the previous visiting scholar, and I started to organize the conference for 2020. So we framed the conference call for proposals. We disseminated that. We put together a reading team. We vetted the proposals that came in, contacted those who had submitted proposals. So there was a big process there. That was all done last spring and summer of 2019. Then in the late fall and winter, Kate Scarth, who was, of course, the chair of the Lucy Maud Montgomery Studies with the Institute, we put together a SSHRC Connection Conference grant application, which was successful, which we're very happy about. Yeah. And we were at this time, we were putting together a program, and we had a program of approximately 75 scholarly presentations and creative projects. And one thing, again, that I did, which is not necessarily what a visiting scholar would do, I initiated a mentorship program. So we were still working on that. That's still a program that we're working with. And then what happens? COVID-19 hit hard.
Well, this is just one of those things, isn't it, Lesley? Yeah. I mean, I have to say, like, the first time I was accepted, so flipping the microphone for a moment, the first time I was accepted to the conference, I mean, this is the global L.M. Montgomery conference, right? This is a world-class
it's called the International Conference.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's the standard, the gold standard. And you have to have your application, your proposal in like 7 months or 8 months before the conference. It's so, yeah. And so I did that. And then I was very pleased. I was very pleased to be again on this program. But, this is now the week that we should all be
Yeah.
sitting and having ice cream. We should be listening to these scholars in the UPEI campus. So tell us about kind of what happened, what's disrupted it, and then we'll start peeking towards the future.
So it was of course February, March, April. I was actually in Portugal for the month of February and March. So I watched it taking over in Italy and in Spain, and then creeping into Portugal. I came back on the 18th of March from Portugal. And by that time, it was pretty obvious how dire the situation was. So eventually, and this was mid-April, it made it necessary to cancel the on-site conference. But out of that, we wanted to, a lot of work obviously put into it, and we wanted to retrieve as much of the program as possible. And it wasn't just the program, of course, I said that we had 75 presenters that had been working on material. And so one of the things we had considered was a new platform for it, but then it became obvious, well, we had a platform already to host the content. And so the decision was made to use the Journal of Lucy Bell Montgomery Studies to host the content that we had planned for the original conferences, of course, as much as possible. So at that point, Kate Scarth and I put out another call for papers. We invited participation in this new endeavor, a kind of virtual conference, if you will. We're calling it the Forum. And it will be accessed through the journal webpage.
Yeah, this is, and one thing that I appreciate about this as part of that group that are in conversation waiting for the conference was this, you've made this about as open as possible for scholars and artists and creative minds and lovers of Montgomery to be involved.
Yes.
And then, of course, it will be as open as possible to get that stuff eventually. Can you tell us now, like moving from, a conference with a couple of hundred people in rooms and breakout groups and everything and dinner to this new space? Is it all in one weekend or is it a long time? Tell us a little bit about what you have planned for this conference.
So what we're calling, so we wanted to use that time when the conference would traditionally have been held, and this year the dates would have been the 24th to the 28th of June. And what we're looking at is a kind of a soft launch, if you will, for material that's going to come out over the next 6 to 8 months. So the deadline for all material is the 31st of December, but we're going to have this soft launch. And if you think what a soft launch is, for example, in a restaurant, they'll have a soft launch and they'll bring out 3 items that they're going to have on their menu. And then over the next 6 months, they'll bring out more and more of their full menu. So that's exactly what we're thinking of it here. So there's 5 days, so the 24th to the 28th of June. We have lots of content that's going up. There's a whole variety of postings. Some of it will be written content, some of it's pre-recorded, and some will be visual material. So I'd like to mention just the different kinds of projects.
I'd love that because this podcast is really part of the early part of that. Yeah. This is the launch in a sense, right?
Exactly. So, So there's going to be some, first of all, I mentioned the creative projects. So there's going to be creative projects. And I'm just going to mention one. There will be more than one. But this is called the Domestic Art Challenge. It was initiated by Bonnie Tulloch, who was a 28 recipient of the Elizabeth Epperly Early Career Award. So Bonnie, with one of the student assistants, Heidi Haering, has been creating a kind of visual representation with pictures that have been submitted. They had put out a call for papers, or not papers, but a call for pictures, actually. This is a CFP, but a call for pictures, which had been submitted to them. And what they wanted to do was celebrate the heroism in everyday life, like during the COVID-19 pandemic. So their project focuses on heroism within the context of the domestic art, such as cooking and baking, gardening, knitting, crafting, reading, all of those kinds of things. So this is a wonderful project, and we actually hope it'll go on beyond the launch as well. So that's just one example of a kind of creative projects, which we would traditionally have on site, but now it will be up on the forum. Usually, as you would expect, there's going to be scholarly content. So again, I'll just mention a couple of what's happening. So on the Thursday, which will be the second day of the launch, of the 25th, there will be an illustrated essay that I have written on visual culture, storytelling, and becoming Emily. So it was really wonderful to be able to use this kind of a forum because I have 24 images, which can be accessed right there without the use of a PowerPoint presentation.
Right.
So that's one example. Then on the Friday, there will be a recorded conversation between Mara Guber, who was one of the keynote speakers, and her research assistant, Fanning Yang. And it'll be a work in progress. They're going to talk about how things are evolving in the work that they're doing. And they're focusing on Anne's monologues within the novel, but also within dramatic versions of Anne. And then I'll just mention one more of the scholarly presentation. There'll be a recorded presentation from Jessica Brown, who's from the University of Limerick. And she was going to do both a workshop and a paper. And she has done a recorded version of her presentation. And her topic is Eyes for Avonlea Montgomery's Effective Rendering of Nature. And I viewed it. It's really, really wonderful.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Yeah.
That's what's going to be expected, but there's going to be some other things as well. Obviously, you're going to have sort of the Institute-related content. There'll be tributes to the patrons. There'll be announcements of new projects that we would normally, again, do. But fun. So,
good stuff. And that's all in just the launch weekend. There's also going to be the same kind of like papers and presentations and essays and
rolled out
videos.
Over 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, that's gorgeous.
So when you think of it, you were just getting a little sampling of what to expect.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's like having actually the conference all year long, and people can access it anywhere in the world. Will that be hosted on the L.M. Montgomery Institute website? Is that where?
Well, through the journal, right?
Through the journal website. Yeah, absolutely.
We're sort of thinking that as a room off of the journal page, a forum or a space that goes under all sorts of different names. So one of our big challenges was, how do we have fun on this kind of forum? So on the first day, after the welcomes, we will be having a Kaylee.
Oh.
So how do you do a Kaylee? Well, this is going to be hosted by Braden Press, and they'll be celebrating their launch of the Gaelic translation of Anne of Green Gables. So we're working with Braden Press on hosting that. So Kaylees are always fun. So you may not be able to dance to the fiddler, but you can dance in your kitchen, I guess, to and just things like Bookmark, for example, is a Charlottetown bookstore. They usually host some kind of books sale during the conference. They're going to do a virtual version of that. They'll feature new books, and there'll be links to their website. If I could mention another one as well, one of the events that we were all really looking forward to for the on-site conference was the screening of Amazing Grace. It's a documentary about Aretha Franklin's 1972 live recording of the gospel album. So one may say, well, what does that have to do with Montgomery? So Evelyn White, who is a Halifax journalist, was going to introduce the screening of that and explain the link between Montgomery and Aretha Franklin. Obviously can't be in person to do it. So she's done it in the form of a blog. So.
And she was a keynote or plenary a couple of years ago. Is that right?
I think she was on a plenary. And based on that, we invited her to do this.
Lesley, that sounds like a great schedule. Do you have one more thing that you wanted to add just to entice us into this visual space?
So on the very final day, one of the much anticipated, as a tradition in the biennial conference, is the Sunday bus tour. We're going to have a virtual version of that that Carolyn Collins and Bernadetta Molesky have done for us. And then there's the finale. It will be pre-recorded, and if the tech gods are good to us, it will be live. And we'll be making announcements at that, such as the recipients of various awards. So also at the finale, we'll be announcing the next visiting scholar whose term begins July 2021, and also the next conference theme, that is the theme of the 15th Biennial Conference in 2022. So again, what we really hoped was that this material would appeal to a diverse audience, because our community, the Montgomery community, really is a diverse community. There are the academic researchers and teachers, there are the creative artists and writers, the musicians, the actors. There's those whose interests are in the fields of tourism or publishing, book selling, book and memorabilia collecting. And then there's those who just join us to listen and then come into the conversations as the opportunities arise. So these are all the kinds of things that we envision for the L.M. Montgomery Envision Forum. And one last note, the beauty of the forum like this, and this goes back to a point you were making early, is it's welcome to everybody, because quite often people can't come for professional or personal or geographical reasons. And this year's original program had papers from 13 different countries. So obviously Canada and the United States, the UK, Ireland, but also Germany, Austria, Poland, Slovakia, South Africa. And it is truly an international conference. This forum gives us the opportunity to become a truly global community, a truly global forum.
Wow, that's brilliant. Lesley, thanks so much for sitting down with us today.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, Brenton.
Good stuff. Just so listeners know, we have links in our show notes to Dr. Clement's work, as well as the themes that we're talking about today and the conference space, the forum, so that you can find your way there and enjoy everything that Dr. Clement has talked about today. And as always, you can check out the L.M. Montgomery Institute at lmmontgomery.ca. It includes interactive features, guest blogs, news about conferences and calls for papers, and the newest releases of the Journal of L.M. Montgomery Studies. It also has links to digital resources like the beautiful online repository, Kindred Spaces. And if you enjoyed the MaudCast and would like others to enjoy it as well, please share on social media and give us a rating. It really helps spread the news about MaudCast and the Institute's work, and helps get the word out about cutting-edge research and new initiatives. I'm your host, Brenton Dickieson, and I'm here with Technical Director Kristy McKinney. Until next time, remember Anne's answer to Mrs. Barry's greeting? I am well in body, although considerably rumpled up in spirit. I think that's a great note for today's moment. Farewell.